Hey there, welcome to the Reinsurance Podcast, the place where we dive into all things reinsurance, the coolest part of insurance. We're your hosts, Jared and Ben, a couple of ex-practitioners who loved the industry so much we founded Supercede to tackle some of its biggest headaches. And we're here to share our insights and stories with expert guests as we uncover what's really going on in the industry.
Despite the enthusiasm and laughter, Jared and I are this week struck down by a vicious cold. Thank goodness we don't have any guests with us today, Jared.
No, exactly.
We'd be spreading this around the whole industry.
This week's podcast brought to you by Lemsip.
Although, actually, no, we probably shouldn't debate the...
You're gonna weigh in on the Baraka versus Lemsip?
No. I was going to weigh in on some interesting rulings about ingredients used in certain manufacturers' products and how they're potentially not effective. But I wouldn't want to accidentally line us up for a libel suit. So I'll skip over my challenge to massive US pharmaceutical companies for this week.
So, people who will beat us in court, large US pharmaceuticals.
Who should we start what with next?
But speaking about data, I was trying
that was smooth.
There was some. We wanted to circle back on on this episode is we were going to dive more into our two favorite topics, data and reinsurance.
Wonderful.
I mean,
everyone feels at home now.
Everyone, yeah.
Nothing like
you two. Get a warm blanket and your Lemsip, and we shall bless you with a conversation on reinsurance data.
Exactly. There's a space where nothing bad happens because it can only get better.
I mean, it's a low starting point, isn't it?
Exactly.
Where should we start? We've talked before about sort of the long history of how our industry sort of used data, right? The earliest points, it's like a pure gamble. Like, this ship may or may not make it. Let's just wager on that thing. And then it's maybe sort of captains who have a better success record, so they get a better price than new captains. There's always been an evolution of how we think about the information that we have and how do we leverage information to understand risk. In the last several years, what's the number? It's something like we create more data or information every year than the history of humanity before that year. It's some shocking number like this, isn't it?
It is crazy. And it's to the point where even I did a work experience before I started any kind of work at the British Library, where they are tasked with keeping a record of every physical book that's published. And already they had run out of room of physical assets. It was just expanding like faster than their collection could keep pace with. That was physical assets. Like, imagine digital at this point. It's like you're very much at a point where you have to choose what to keep, what not to keep. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's what to keep, what not to keep is kind of the challenge the industry writ large is wrestling with at the moment, where we have more data than we've ever had before, but it also adds a huge amount of noise and chaos into our understanding of risk. Like, what parts of this data give us insights around understanding a risk and what is just noise, or it might have a sort of a correlation component to it, but by no means is this thing causing this other thing, and should we lean into that correlation as a pricing consideration or not?
And that's why in today's episode, we're going to unpick for you, what are you missing in your data? How can you tell fact from fiction? How can you get through the cloud of buzzy, foggy noise and find the bits of data that really matter? There we are, setting us up for a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm intimidated by the setup.
Let's make it. Give ourselves a goal.
Yeah. It is. So you're right. And so we think about if we sort of take a quick look in the rearview mirror at sort of the massive data moments in our industry. One of the most sort of compelling one from the last sort of 4 or 5 years is the introduction of IoT. And it's not just telematics, which is what this vehicle is doing, but like, what about the information that your refrigerator generates, and that every item in your home now connects to the internet and generates data? That should give us such a profound view of risk.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's really never come to fruition in the same way, I would posit.
Yeah, it's funny, and I think part of this, the potential is there, but it's a real challenge to align all the stakeholder interests in a successful way. I think if you take Tesla is a great example of this, right? You've got these cars that have got tons of sensors on them, loads of data across loads of different vectors. Tesla has got to the point where they started selling their own insurance, and they're the ones with all that data. So there's a good alignment there. It's sort of a aligned insurance data proposition, you could argue. And then outside of motor insurance, which is mandatory, you see similar kind of things that can be seen as aligned warranty propositions. So it's like, oh, we provide engine parts and we got a sensor in them to say when this engine's going to break, and so we fix it beforehand, or we try and we have great data about how frequently these things break, so we know what that warranty should cost, etc. But most of the time, actually, there isn't that alignment, right? It's like, we're going to insure you for your house burning down. We, the insurer, actually don't have access to all the data being generated by your Amazon Alexa or your refrigerator or everything else. Right? That's many different companies. They're all providing tons of different bits of data, and we haven't really found a way to package that in a useful way. I love, for example, a few new models of car were created. I think some of the new Jaguar Land Rover vehicles were fitted with like environmental emissions detectors. So as you're driving around different neighborhoods, you can take a reading of like how polluted the air is outside your vehicle. Really cool for potential ESG insurance, and sort of not, I'm using an umbrella term for like environmental damage and pollution kind of insurance and liability potential there, right? Imagine if you've got that data set and live, thanks to all these drones almost going around scouting the pollution. But again,
and
it's not aligned.
Right, and that misalignment is sort of trickling through where Tesla embedded and they want their own products, and that all makes sense. So that's very, very tightly aligned. The other OEMs, like BMW, has no incentive to then transmit all of the data they have to insert motor insurer of your choice. And so whilst the data is there, there's that incentive to do it, and the insurers aren't necessarily wanting to pay up for it.
Yep.
The other one that's really interesting in an aligned perspective is the usage of data for things like plane manufacturers and engines, and like they know, so they can optimize the repair cycles and things, because they know that if they can keep those really expensive pieces of kit running efficiently with low cost and optimizing the maintenance schedule and all these things, they will get much more out of that. But the insurance industry sort of sits just the side of it, and they're kind of going, well, what's the likelihood of and they can say, you should give us a better price on this premium because we have optimized our repair cycles. So the insurer can go, I believe you, and the sort of last few years have shown the sort of damage and warranty claims have come down, therefore we will give you a better price. But the insurers have always sort of seen to be sitting at the end where a company has said, we've used data to improve these things and are therefore a better risk, and here's the data to justify that. And the insurer goes, great. But the end result for the insurer is better performance against risk will meet a better price. And I think reinsurance is the epitome of that, where it's like, I don't care how you're underwriting your motor book and what kind of telematics you're using. What the reinsurers care about, because all the data that they can get is that book performing better? Are there fewer losses, or is the magnitude of those losses smaller because of the work that you're doing? And if so, you will get a better price in the market.
I think that's really interesting, because you're seeing the adoption of greater data, effectively, or data-led insurance propositions, more with distressed customers or customers where there's a really obvious case for a newer mitigation to be overlaid. So, for example, telematics for young drivers who otherwise would struggle to pay for their car insurance. Similarly, cyber-like security products, for example, that are included as part of a cyber insurance for small businesses proposition. Those things do generate more data and hopefully also reduce the risk of claims for those customers adopting them. They don't necessarily make that portfolio more attractive, as you say, to a reinsurer, right? It's actually enabling a given insurer to go deeper on a portfolio that would otherwise be a bit unattractive, or they would have to work harder to sell it, or potentially be charging a lot more for it. So, I mean, in some ways, is it meaning that they're at risk of undercharging in exchange for the data that they're getting? So it's quite interesting to think about to what extent new sources of insurance, like primary underwriting data, actually would have a useful impact on your reinsurance purchasing.
Yeah. I think where it could is if you have it where in your portfolio, if you're an insurer, the better able you are to sort of carve and manipulate what your portfolio looks like to identify different trends. So if you use that motor example, you have the telematics product, which is adopted more widely for younger drivers. Can you carve out that younger population and begin to understand the data, and then maybe even think about how you change a reinsurance purchase by saying, we're actually going to buy the motor book in 2 different tranches. We're going to buy the younger pool book and the more established pool book, or vice versa. You sort of blend it in and you sort of try to grow this other part more because it balances out. But so oftentimes the insurance companies, even though they're doing those types of things and they have elements of their book that are being driven by improvements of technology, how they're better underwriting the original policies, when they start to aggregate it in their own books, they lose sight of that. They don't have a lens as to, is the performance of those younger drivers because of telematics fundamentally better or not?
I like this thinking. So you used a word there which is interesting. Aggregation. Is aggregation even still necessary nowadays? And I will continue to justify this point. Typically what we've seen historically, due to the challenge of an insurance company sharing all of its data with reinsurers, has been that just wouldn't be feasible. Right? Like the data they capture was in legacy mainframe systems. There was tons of it. It wasn't necessarily all formatted the same, etc. And you couldn't just pass that to a reinsurer. And maybe you wouldn't want to as well for, if you're afraid of the reinsurer judging you for what's in there, perhaps you wouldn't want to, reveal all on the first date.
Yeah.
But what that led to was this sort of industry practice of doing very aggregated views of the book. I remember we used to look at things like, thank you for sharing us like how many policies you have in each of these sets of bandings. And then in order to assess what's in your portfolio, we will assess the quality of the risk, like what type of risk is it based on some very broad high-level categories, and what is the midpoint of each banding, and that times the number of policies in that banding, etc., because we don't know the actual individual amounts for each of those individual records. And you stop and you think, okay, if we had all the tools we have now, does it still make sense to be aggregating, adding midpoints and coming up with like lots of
like blended curves and stuff?
Yeah, when actually, I mean, even with our things, we theoretically could be opening up data sets and just giving people access to data nowadays.
Yeah.
And being like, well, why don't you just look at what it really is? Because actually you could cause a heck of a lot more confusion being like, why have they got, like one policy in the 0 to 1 million band? And it could be, well, actually it's a 999,000 policy, or it could be actually it's a 1,000 policy, but we don't know.
Yeah.
Because we had to aggregate it into these bands.
Yeah.
You could find all sorts of much more salient ways. You could get an AI to show you the best way to represent it. You could play with the bandings. You could do all sorts of different things to represent it differently. But I think we've grown used to this habit of, we must reduce to this very aggregated version of data, when actually we could be working to the point where it's like, here's effectively the individual telematics data for that one policyholder.
Yeah. When we were a couple of years ago, I was at a sort of a little round table in Monte Carlo, and we were talking about this sort of topic. And one of the positions that was raised was, at a certain point in the industry, do we transition towards like, if there's reinsurance, everything gets fact. Like every individual homeowner's policy then gets a component of fact attached to it, and it pools up, and they think about aggregation as a collection of fractional facultative policies rather than treaties, as you said, that have arbitrary aligned. And the thing that I'm most excited about for the industry is I don't know, and that's good. Like, it might not be that, but it might also, as you said, absolutely not just a completely broad, like, here are the 5 buckets we've got. Like, we will continue to leverage data. I think what we've gotten a bit over anxious and like try to jump in with more, but the better we're able to sort of go slowly to go faster, like we will be able to sort of start to be able to sort of carve out points of data and go, this might not be the best way. Maybe we create, instead, because the data is easier to manipulate, maybe we should have hundreds of bands in a treaty rather than 8, because we can get a better lens. Or it's instead of it being like a 2D, it's like hundreds of bands across 5 different filters that give you a micro book inside of the books. Or this way where a reinsurer can go, okay, I see what you're doing here, and I can really calibrate my pricing much, much further down than was historically available.
And I worry that even asking us or asking people who've gotten used to that system will ask for a bigger table.
Yeah.
In the the faster horse kind of narrative here. Like, it's like, oh well, if I could have all the data, then I'd ask for this slightly expanded version of what we already had. When actually maybe there's, like, to your point, is it now FAQ on every single policy, or is it actually the treaty mechanism's really useful because it gives us a forward-looking, you've got this extra coverage by default, so go out there this year and write what you want. Maybe it's you've got live treaty, kind of capabilities that change all the time. Maybe it's when you write a policy, it appears on the treaty, and actually a reinsurer knows right away and doesn't get a report after the fact.
Yeah.
But actually everyone can see what's being put onto the treaty in real time.
Yeah.
Like, these are the kind of things that I think are just not envisaged in a world where data for us still means, well, we have to get the bandings. We then have to do some basic Excel calculations to work out how risky this client is.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more potential than that, especially when you look at, like, in the duration of our careers. In 20 years, are we still going to be doing this in the same way?
Right. But the thing that jumped out when you were saying that to me is the burden of doing this work, the burden of prepping and organizing and cutting and chopping the data apart. Because that remains still quite tedious for most people in the industry. Not all. But for most people.
Not all.
Tell me more. But is you have historical things that are sort of bundled together. Like, you've bundled marine and energy portfolios. Marine and energy products and books look very different, but like, we lump them together. You lump cyber into a casualty book. You sort of lump a commercial and a personal lines mode. Like, sure, but like, what an insurance company should want to be able to do is go, what if we bought commercial motor and personal lines motor independently? And maybe not immediately, I'm not that ambitious, but maybe in the course of a day or two, go, actually, that would be a more effective way to do this. But we've been bundling them together for the last 35 years because that's all that we've been able to do. And it's so much work to try to roll it back and get a view on what that would have looked like historically. Should we buy these things differently? And at a certain point, there is the sort of cost to get out of bed threshold. Like, a reinsurer is not like, I'm super keen to underwrite the process of underwriting this risk if the premium is going to be a $2 million whatever book. So they've lumped them together to appeal to the big reinsurers. But if we get the reinsurers to be able to ingest data more quickly and automate parts of their pricing process, and you get it where the cedents can carve data apart and the brokers can carve that data apart and throw out various options, I think you'll see that creativity in a breaking down of sort of the historical, like, it's the way we've done it for the last couple of decades.
It's interesting because it brings us back to that aggregation topic in some ways. And there'll be different strengths and weaknesses to these strategies for buyers and sellers. And this goes back to pricing, which was what I think Cordy originally wanted us to talk about. But
we'll get there in the
sorry,
end.
Cordy. The angle that you just described there of, like, could we break down purchases further and be more specific there? The opposite of that we often experience at the moment, look at like a whole account aggregate kind of type coverage. Those things act as a pre-diversified block of risk, right? In theory. So a reinsurer is able to back a piece of that big pre-diversified block that represents actually a single insurance company's way of doing business. So they might be diversified in terms of all the different things that insurer does, but actually it's not at all diversified in terms of that one firm's appetite, style of working, approach to data, etc. It's a pure exposure. You could see a world where if you were able to break purchases down to a much smaller level, a more specific level, you'd empower the reinsurers more to take many, many smaller bets and play the role of building a builder of diversified portfolios, right? As in, if the reinsurer is there to take lots and lots of bets across many different insurers' portfolios, they're going to be better at diversifying their portfolios the more different things they can take, right? Like lots and lots of different participations. And what works against that, arguably, is when a buyer does that for them and sort of lumps it all together.
Yep.
The reinsurers then having to sort of load quite a lot, presumably for uncertainty. They're probably like, oh, how much of this is marine war versus marine hull? And, you know, how much of this is this other account versus this other account? Whereas potentially if you could get to a world where you had quite granular reinsurance opportunities, then, and very smooth data, very low barriers to entry, we could have an industry where, you know, reinsurance underwriters are doing, you know, like tens of thousands of deals, like micro deals, and they build up a whole portfolio where actually any one given exposure is actually really small, and they're less likely to have a single moment of volatility due to one program, but actually they've got thousands of micro exposures almost.
When I think because of how our industry works, then you're going to see a knock-on effect then to how retro evaluates the portfolios of that sort of approach, and how people underwrite and price it in that same sort of way. There will always be, in all of these things, there's always, the more we can fracture it down to start, it just changes how it gets aggregated upstream. And the same way we've introduced technology now that allows people and individuals and companies to buy fractional shares of companies. It's like, but then those get rolled up into portfolios. That so there is sort of this pursuit of aggregation and diversification. And I think that will always be the case. But the more granular we can get on the ground will allow us to sort of think about what those portfolios look like a little bit differently. You can, when you think about like your diversity across like tech as an investment category, if you're able to get fractional shares across companies, you can have a bunch across the sort of top 25 tech firms, but then a bunch across a huge array of other types of firms. And you get a bit more sort of coverage based on your risk appetite. So I think you'll see that same behavior happening, but with a lens that's a bit more designed to interrogate how portfolio gets structured with that ability to do more granular work.
And I guess this also relates to sort of going back to our history topic. A long time ago, the way in which a reinsurer would choose to price or to back an insurance company would be largely based on their management team, right? They'd be like, these guys seem to know what they're doing, give them a good price. This person seems to have a good plan, we'll back them, and we'll follow their fortunes. And over time, that balance has been shifting more and more towards actually is what the data says. Or as much as I like Sandra and the way she runs her business, I also want to see that there's some data in there supporting what's going on. That change, I think, probably is going to continue in the same direction. As people see, you know, that as much as they think the management team of a massive multi-billion-dollar reinsurance operation is brilliant, there is a limit to how much impact. I know there's a couple of firms, or at least one firm in the market that famously possibly underwrites its entire portfolio with one person overseeing every single one of those deals. Whether the whole market would choose to do that, to really, you know, rely on one person, whether that would be a sensible thing to do, is a question. So as far as I can tell, you know, we're on a trend from day one. It's all about the management team. There isn't any data. To ultimately, well, we'd rather just see all the data and make our own decisions and know that the management team aren't a nightmare or aren't crazy. But at the end of the day, we want to see what the data says.
At the end of the day, there's this position of prove it. Like, you're saying this is going to make your performance better? Like, show evidence to me that is in fact the case. And again, what we've seen historically is that, and we talk about this in like pricing loading conversations. If the insurance company says this is what's happening, so our book is doing, it's gonna be better, and the reinsurer goes, great, we trust you, we love your team, we back the management strategy, so show us in the data how that works. And they can't, the reinsurer, like, we'll still do the deal, but like, we're just going to have to take the conservative loss picks. We're just going to have to adjust for sort of, if you're not, like, because you can't evidence to us, not that we don't believe you, but like, we're not going to put our balance sheet so much at risk that if you are wrong, because you cannot evidence it to us, that we are taking a disproportionate hit here. So you're always going to see that until the insurers get enough control of their data in which they can say, sure, here you go. And the reinsurer's like, brilliant. That I love the strategy, and now you have the data that backs up that what this is doing. We're on that journey now. That's the stage of this journey that we're in.
And I think I would make a really important, it's a good word, a legal term that eludes me temporarily. Distinguish, there we are. I would distinguish this reasoning that we're talking about here of ever more data importance versus management team interest. I would distinguish that is more likely to be the case from a reinsurance underwriter's perspective than it would be, for example, for an investor in a company's perspective. So the street might look more heavily at the management team and its decisions because shareholders are more closely aligned to the incentives of people who have their targets aligned to the performance of that company, to people who have ownership in the company that they're, a part of. I might well choose to buy stock in a company because I think they've got great leadership. As much as there is a narrative and a spirit of partnership in our industry and working together with our reinsurance partners, actually the incentives of an insurance company and a reinsurance company are not fully aligned. Yes, ideally, in a lot of circumstances, everybody wins and it's a good hedge for everybody and everybody kind of makes money out of the agreement. But you do have winners and you do have losers. Sometimes the reinsurers suffer because of, maybe not getting the data that they wanted from their insurance companies, and they're wise to that, and so they charge more if they're not sure about what they're getting. Similarly, the insurers have incentives to get as good a return on their reinsurance purchase as they can. So that is, I think, part of why data becomes more important in that relationship than perhaps, in other relationships where it might continue to be the case that actually I want to buy their stock or I want to work there because I like the management team. Do I want to reinsure them? Show me the data.
Yeah. It's super interesting. And we've talked about this topic so much, and I like it because I still come to like things I've not thought of and considered before. But it also reinforces in many ways the importance of the relationships between parties, because you have one where you're both mutually dependent on each other to some degree. But in an environment, as you just put out, I think exactly right, where sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And if you have it where people see it as combative, and that winning and losing is like, oh, I've beaten you or you've beaten me, that doesn't work. But we have an environment where it's like, we're trying to achieve a similar thing, but there will be a disproportionate winner each time.
Yeah.
Right. And the market cycles are sort of the result of like, ooh, disproportionate winning for too long for these people. And, but it reinforces the fact that if a cedent has had very low claims history for a number of years, the reinsurer's been winning for a while. And then a massive event happens and the reinsurer gets rinsed for it. That the cedent's also like, great, I will make sure that we help get you, like you have this sort of recognition that this is a long-term journey together. And we only get there if we sort of recognize it's not always fair and there's always going to be a trade-off, but we're trying to figure out how we effectively do this together.
I actually prefer your iteration here, and I like the idea that actually we can reframe that narrative slightly. So you need the data for the reinsurers, not despite the relationship and so on and so forth, but actually because the reinsurers are the custodians of the pool of backup premium that the insurance companies rely on, right? Like the job of the reinsurance market is to make sure that there's going to be enough money left over and enough money to support the cost of capital, such that should there be a need to claim upon it, it's there to step in and to be available. We talk about the protection gap. We talk about the effectiveness of the reinsurance market in places where it's very difficult to, get reinsurance coverage. If there isn't data supporting the reinsurers in their ability to price risk and aggregate risk, then they can't perform that role effectively. The reinsurance market exists for the insurers. They are providing a really valuable service, and in order to do their job properly, they need to be receiving really good data. They can't just trust in management teams. They can't curate the quality of a pool that the whole industry relies on just based on whether they think the management team are good. They've got to have the data.
Yeah. Well, and this is where we're seeing the conversation on Supercede, especially about data happening, is it's better data like in partnership, like cedents and brokers working to make and prepare better, cleaner data so they can pass that to those reinsurers with a better sense of like this alignment of we want to make sure that you have a better view of what we are doing and why, and have that transparency. So the reinsurer builds confidence. Sure, that's going to help pricing, and sure, it's going to give them better sort of terms in the market because that loading is coming down. But more than anything else, it's this sort of willingness of like, listen, some of this is on us.
Yeah.
We need to give you better for this partnership and this relationship to be as effective as it possibly can.
Yeah.
Part of this is we have to bring you better data too. And we're doing that now. We are investing in giving you better data because it's part of our contribution to this thing. It's moving away from it being sort of not unilateral. I think it's or monodirectional. I think it still is bi-directional. It goes both ways, but it's a recognition that both parties have to be contributing a bit more to help solve it for the other.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's only more effective to the other party if you contribute more and they contribute more. Like, and then you get that reciprocity a bit more effectively.
We could get into a really interesting discussion about how to devise a sort of tax system for insurers that leads to an appropriate amount of premium ending up in the pool.
Yeah.
I think it's a strength in many ways of the system that it's not like an arbitrary number, but actually it's the quality of what you contribute to the pool that determines the amount of price that you pay as your contribution to a pool that supports everyone.
Yeah. One of the things we deviated from it as we went into the reinsurance space, which we're prone to do on the reinsurance podcast. But one of the things that it's always sort of been on my mind as we think about how we leverage data to underwrite original risk more effectively is this sort of ethical component of does our ability to understand good risk move the price down so much for the good risks that the price for the less than ideal risks has to be sort of increased, resulting in much, much higher premiums for that pool. But if we sort of zoom out, it'd be relatively obvious which are the groups that are going to have access to better risks, better technology, better funding to sort of lean into that, and which are the companies who are sort of left on the outside, who are less able to invest up front and less able to improve the quality of their risk in the immediate term. But if you have this deviation of pricing based on that, are we sort of trapped where those individuals get unbelievably good pricing, like nearly at cost, and these ones, because they're so much more risky, like they just can't afford it, and you begin to create a deeper protection gap in some ways.
Yeah, I think we should do at some point a US health insurance and life insurance episode, because that's such a good case study for that type of thing. And the other thing in Europe that's going to be interesting to watch coming out soon is the new EU regulations on ESG reporting and data. Because again, that's going to start flagging, who's working with the net positive impactors and the net negative impactors and so on in terms of how good someone's portfolio is. But yeah, there's a ton of interesting stuff to dive into there in terms of what's in your portfolio and how are you supporting risk holders at the end of the day for good, for evil, or
and I think the takeaway would be like for companies to think about if they had everything at their fingertips, like what would be the way that they'd start to interrogate? How would they think about the way you're doing if you think that the way you're doing your business and structuring your data now is the result of the way you've done it for the last several years for justifiable reasons, if that ability to manipulate data changed, what would you begin to ask? What are the questions that are in the back of your mind of going, oh, what if instead we did it this way? Like that'll be the thing that'll be interesting, and the thing will play out over the next few years. But until next time, that's all for today.
Is that the end?
That's the end.
Thank goodness, I really need to blow my nose. Cold-filled episode.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
See you later. Thanks for tuning in to the Reinsurance Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing, preferably 5 stars. For more insights and updates, follow us on LinkedIn and visit our website at supercede.co.